Welcome to the Startup Help Desk. We are here to answer your questions about building companies, starting companies, and the meaning of life. We have questions submitted by people just like you who are starting their own companies, and a panel of experts to help answer them. Our panelists are all experienced founders, executives, investors. We've seen all of it over decades. We're here to share that with you and help you on your own journey. My name is Sean Burns. I've been a founder of companies for about 20 years. 18 months ago, I shifted over to venture capital when I started a new firm called Near Horizon. And I'm lucky to be joined by two illustrious panelists, Ash and Nick.
Hi, everybody. My name's Ash Rust, and I'm a pre-seed investor based in San Francisco. I mostly invest in B2B companies based in the US and UK at the idea stage through my fund, Sterling Road. I've also worked at places like Trinity Ventures as an entrepreneur in residence and Bullpen Capital as an advisor. Before investing, I was an entrepreneur myself, most notably an early employee at the social media analysis company Clout, as well as the CEO and co-founder of SendHub. These days, I spend most of my time coaching founders, and I've helped more than 1,500 startups over the years.
Hey, this is Nick Melionis. I'm co-founder and CEO of a startup called Navi. We help people and organizations learn innovation skills, solve mission-critical problems, and bring new ideas to life. I've supported hundreds of folks and organizations on their startup quests, and I can't wait to jump into today's questions.
So, Nick, if at Navi you ever have a scandal, would you call it Navigate? Is that what you would call it? I think you should.
Yeah, I think we need to go ahead and brand that one, keep it in our back pocket so that we are scandal ready.
Make it a Slack emoji.
Yeah, exactly. We need to have that scandal ready.
Well, in addition to the bad jokes, we do have answers to questions for you today. And all of our questions were submitted by people like you. So if you'd like us to answer your questions in a future episode, head over to thestartuphelpdesk.com or find us on X/Twitter as thestartuphd. All the questions you'll hear today were submitted those ways. So go ahead, submit them, and you'll hear it on a future episode. Our questions today are all about competitive advantages. Hopefully you have them. If you don't, hopefully you can find some. Competitive advantages are what help you beat the competition. And we'll talk a lot about competitive advantages. What do they look like? How do you find them today? So let's jump in. Here's our first question. We started a few months ago, and pre-seed investors are asking about our competitive advantages. We're so early, I don't think we have any. What competitive advantages can we have so soon? For those of you who don't know, pre-seed is usually the earliest round, the very, very first round. And so this is an interesting question.
Comes after the dirt round.
Nick, what do you think, man? What kind of competitive advantages can you have at the gestational phases of a company?
It's challenging. Some competitive advantages are real. Some competitive advantages are perspective. Competitive advantages typically emerge over time. And so you can look back and say, yep, we've got one. But it's a lot harder to understand with absolute certainty you have one today. That being said, common technical advantages can be deep technical expertise. So if you're building something that requires some technical horsepower, and if you have a team that has demonstrated the ability to execute that in the past, then that's an advantage. Another advantage is distribution. If you already have some existing brand name customers and an existing Rolodex, let's say you worked elsewhere and built amazing relationships and sales leads, and you're bringing those relationships with you to your startup, that's a huge advantage. And so distribution can be absolutely fantastic. And then, of course, if you are an established founder, so you've had some successes already, you can bring your brand with you, so to speak, and give yourself an advantage. That being said, these are things that give you a running start, but they're not necessarily guaranteed enduring advantages. Ash, what's your take on this?
I don't expect you to have a competitive advantage today, but I do expect you to have a plan. So have you done the customer discovery calls to understand what people desperately need and can't currently get? Is there a path to you building some kind of long-term advantage within that? Do you have an idea of what that advantage might look like when it's implemented and deployed? And do you have the expertise on your team to build it? So I don't need to see a fully developed, Google.com search engine as a competitive advantage today, but I do need to understand that you have the vision, the team, and the potential customer work already done to see that path.
That actually brings up an interesting question for me, which is Nick laid out a whole bunch of advantages. Ash, you do pre-seed investing. What percentage of deals do you see that actually have a tangible competitive advantage at the point that you're meeting them in those early stages?
Oftentimes it's going to be something that's based on maybe university research there. So if someone's coming out of a university accelerator program or a research lab or something like that, then they may have something. But a competitive advantage isn't just some kind of technical advantage. It's also one that customers want. So have people who have those technical advantages also usually done the customer discovery? No, almost never. So it's usually one or the other. You've either done the customer discovery work to understand that you need to build something that's going to be hard and you've not started that yet, or you've already done the hard building part, but you have no idea if anyone cares.
That is the fundamental issue and challenge when it comes to startups at large. I think you absolutely nailed it there, because ultimately there's these frontiers emerging through research or new technologies emerging. And there's folks who understand what problems exist in the world through talking to users. The magic is blending the two, which gives you an advantage, but very challenging.
Well, the flip side of my question is going to be interesting. Both Ash and Nick, when you meet early stage companies, how often do they think they have a competitive advantage and you have to explain to them that it isn't really a competitive advantage?
Well, patents are the biggest cause of that. A lot of people think that patents are going to protect them from competitors and or close customers, when in actual fact what's happened is their lawyer has convinced them to spend a few $1,000s that they probably shouldn't have done.
It's a tricky spot to be right there.
Yeah. I will say that at least my experience, I do find quite often I meet with companies, and just to Ash's point, they think they have a competitive advantage. They bought a specific domain name, or they think their network is deeper than it is. And a lot of the early stage, I think, coaching is just explaining to them that maybe they don't have all the cards they thought they had. And the journey will, as a result, be a little bit harder than they thought it would be.
And your competitors aren't stupid.
Exactly. Because again, it's not a competitive advantage if everybody has it. That's the other thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, or if it's easy to copy. Yeah.
Just because if you know a bunch of people, if everybody else knows the same people, I'm not sure it's really a competitive advantage. But
yeah, that's an often one that people get stuck on. Is like, what do you mean my industry expertise isn't a competitive advantage? Well, you're in wine and there's quite a few sommeliers out there.
Yeah, it is, in that case, table stakes to be able to pursue this opportunity.
But I drink a lot of wine. Isn't that an advantage? I think that's more a liability. I'm not sure. Okay.
All right.
Cool.
Next question. Move on before we start drinking. Okay. So we thought we had a technology competitive advantage, but some of the new AI developments make it clear we do not. How do we find a new advantage?
I have actually had this conversation with a bunch of companies recently, especially ones that started before the new wave of LLMs and other AI developments, where they thought the approach they had was differentiated. And now it turns out there are easier or different ways to do the same thing with less effort. The first thing I'll say about this is I've always believed competitive advantages are head starts. And so they're always changing. They're never static. It's very rare, unless you're a regulated monopoly, where there's a legal structure that prevents people from competing with you. It's very rare to have a structural advantage that just persists forever. And so if you think about them as head starts, then you're constantly going to be hopefully turning a head start into either another head start or into some other advantage. And as a result, I think your competitive advantages always shift and change. The key question is, what matters for growth? What advantages really matter? As Ash said, there's some advantages you can have that are irrelevant. So what advantages really matter, and how do we make sure we build those or make sure we have them? I find most companies actually do have at least the beginnings of a lot of competitive advantages. If you're selling and doing well, and I'm assuming this company would be in market, there's usually things you're doing very well that might be the core of that. Maybe your customer service is better than everybody else's, or maybe there's something your product does better than everybody else's. You might have that. It might not be a fully blown competitive advantage yet, but look at the parts of your business that are working really well. And what happens if you lean into that 1,000%? Can you turn that into competitive advantage? I often find companies who feel like their product is not pulling ahead. It turns out maybe your customer experience or your customer success can be that advantage because you really have found a different way of working with customers and making them happy. Nick, what do you think, man?
Sean, I like the way you're framing this. I had one question for you too on that. Do you think that hiring effectively and just bringing on amazing talent? Is this one of the overlooked competitive advantages that companies can be able to deploy? It's not easy, but it seems like that's one that's really built for the long haul.
Well, the problem is most competitive advantages are relative, right? And so there's a lot of talented people out there. Your ability to find and hire them doesn't set you apart unless the competition can't do that. One thing I do think in hiring is true is if you can hire smart people and hold on to them long term, that is absolutely something that most companies can't do. The average tenure at startup companies used to be like 2 years less or 18 months last time I looked. If you can hire people that are amazing and keep them on your team for 5 years, you end up with this interesting network effect of sustained knowledge and teamwork. That can be a competitive advantage in my experience. The problem with hiring is unless everybody else can't do it, which is rare, it ends up not being a huge advantage. If you can do it faster, I guess that might be an advantage. I don't know, Ash, what do you think? If a company came to you and said hiring was their competitive advantage, what would have to be true for you to believe it?
I'd be talking to Steve Jobs.
Because you want to recruit dead people? I don't know.
No, because you'd have to be that good of a recruiter. I mean, that is a bold thing to say the least. I think that you would have to demonstrate that you both have a history of hiring great people and that you have done it already on the team. But ordinarily, you would want the output of those team members to be what you articulate as your competitive advantage, not their talent, because hopefully their talent turns into value at some point in the very near future.
That's a really important point, which is, not being able to hire as a liability.
Yeah.
But the lack of a liability is not an advantage. If you can't hire, you're obviously going to struggle against people who can. But just because you can hire doesn't mean you have an advantage. It just might mean that you're able to keep up with everybody else who can also hire, and the people who can't hire fall away. But you can't necessarily beat somebody because you do something that they do equally well. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that just because it's not a liability doesn't mean it's an advantage.
I think that adds up. I do look at the ability to hire and retain talent. If you're very good at it, it is something that is so critically important. And to both your points, I think that is the thing that then unlocks more objectively measured competitive advantages. So it's a good spot to be.
What about if you got 700 people who worked at your company to all say at the same time that everything at the company was about the people, and then over the next 12 months you fired everybody who was against you?
Hypothetically, of course.
Just hypothetically, just checking if that's still the same thing.
I think that's the magic of this world. We've got different perspectives on how to make the magic happen, and we let the market determine exactly how it does happen.
Oh, dear. Spoken like a libertarian close to an election, that's for sure.
Oh, that's good.
You can tell you own a lot of Bitcoin, Nick, that's for sure.
I will say this. I don't think this is a good way to think about competitive advantages, but one thing I have been lucky about in the companies I've started is we've always been able to hire and retain people long term. And when we go to raise financings, I remember the Series B of my last company, one of the things the investors found most compelling was we had almost nobody who had ever left in terms of voluntary attrition, meaning people who you'd otherwise want to stay, leave for another job or something at greener pastures. And the fact that we had almost nobody who did that, I think there may have been one person over the life of the business, was very compelling for them as an advantage. I don't know that I would use investors' perspective on competitive advantages, because what readily matters is in the market, can you beat the competition? But in the grand scheme of things that might help you raise money, it definitely was an advantage in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense.
Cool beans. Well, let's make sure we can get through all of our questions today. We have a quota here. It's a competitive advantage of ours that we always get through it. So Nick, make sure we stay on task.
All right, let's do this. Here's a question we received from a founder. This founder said, our product is clearly better than our competition, but they keep beating us in sales deals. How do we turn our product advantage into better sales success? Ash, want to lead the way here?
Well, are we sure it's better? Because
that is the question.
The customers are choosing a competitor I don't know if we're 100% certain about that. So whenever I hear that, we're like, oh, our competitors are trash, but they keep winning sales deals. I'm always like, well, that doesn't sound like they're trash. It sounds like they've got some kind of advantage over you. So what we need to understand is why these customers, these potential customers, are choosing the competitor over you. Mm-hmm. And if you are better than the competitor and your customers just don't know about it, then we've got to make changes to the messaging to highlight those benefits so we are more likely to win deals. And also, we want to adjust our messaging towards our benefits because it's also going to filter potential customers out that wouldn't be of interest to us because they're going to be, more skewed towards the people who are interested in those benefits. Now, the other thing you can do, I don't advise this as a solution to the problem, but if you are just getting run over by someone else in one particular market and you've built technology, obviously software can move markets. So I wouldn't do this, but you can always test new markets if you want to in this situation as well.
Oh, Ash, I agree. We find ourselves once again in agreement that I am skeptical they have the best product. It's a little bit like just because you like your product better doesn't mean it's actually better. You can imagine teams that are very product centric who have never done sales before and just don't know how to create a sales motion, don't know how to build relationships with customers.
Well, it happens all the time in like the beverage market, right? Like Coca-Cola is not the best beverage on planet Earth, but year after year, it's going to be the best seller. And so I think it articulates the best product doesn't win, but it's not an excuse not to close sales. If you have the best tasting soft drink, you're going to make sales.
Mm. Exactly. And so I think the most important thing that this happened to you is take a really hard look at why people are not buying. It can sometimes be hard to do, but I like to do postmortems with prospects. If you go through a sales process, even if they don't buy, just sitting down and asking them about their perspective on the process and why they made their decisions and how it worked out. Like take a really hard look at everything to make sure you understand why you're not selling or why they're not buying. And address whatever that is, address it head on. Just because your product's better, maybe they can't see the value, right? Maybe the fact that your product's better is hidden in some place that will take them 6 or 9 months to find. Or maybe it really is your sales process and you're not connecting with them a lot. Sales, especially enterprise, is still a lot of relationship driven stuff. It's not all just pure math and logic.
Steak and whiskey.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing how in the days of Zoom, I feel like people who have learned a lot of what they've learned in the last 4 years think that selling on Zoom has always been the way it is. And there's something about meeting people in person that sometimes can get you over the line.
Well, people think selling on Zoom still works when getting on a plane is definitely going to work a lot better. So if we're talking about an enterprise sale that's, high 5 or 6 figures, you're not going to close it without getting off Zoom.
Yeah, regardless of how good your product is. Like at some point, people buy from people. And if you are the person they have a better relationship with, that will definitely be who they buy from. The last thing I'll say with this is the key thing here is if people are buying from your competitors, at least they're buying, right? They have this need and they're buying something. This is a problem you can fix. I almost always see the opposite problem where you have a bunch of companies with offerings and nobody's buying them. And essentially it's a pseudo market, meaning that there wasn't ever really demand. It's just a bunch of people latched on and it looked like a market because there's a few products. So if people are buying, just not buying from you, that is a problem you can fix. And in the grand scheme of things, it's not the worst problem you can have as long as you really focus on solving it. If you ignore it and try to force it to work and try to shake these customers harder to be like, don't you see how good my product is? You're never going to figure it out. It's just not going to happen. Well, last question. This is not asked by the community. It's just something that I'm curious about, Ash and Nick, which is I've noticed in my career, when I first started my career, the competitive advantages I wanted were all product and technology based. And at this point in my career, I've done this for a long time. If you're going to give me one competitive advantage, I want a distribution advantage. I want to be able to reach customers faster and more easily than anybody else. What do you guys think? Has your perspective on competitive advantages changed over your careers?
Well, if I could choose a competitive advantage, I would definitely opt for network effects, although I don't invest in network effects as a paradox there. So I think network effects is probably the strongest, and demonstrated through Facebook's longevity. But as an investor, I much prefer to do technical advantages because I understand them.
I take the distribution side of things when it comes to these competitive advantages. And I think part of it's because you can objectively measure it. Technical advantages can be absolutely fantastic and incredibly valuable. I think it's just a little bit harder to objectively measure it versus distribution. You can see the results. You can test and iterate and see more results and ultimately have more confidence in that being a real advantage.
Fair enough. And let's say you're a podcast, hypothetically speaking. What kind of competitive advantages might a podcast get? I'm asking for a friend, obviously.
Maybe cutting down the hosts from 3 to 2.
Ooh, ouch. Oh, no. We're going to cut this episode off before I get fired here, everyone.
Editor.
That was fun. Okay, we covered a lot of ground around competitive advantages. Hopefully you have one. If not, I hope you find one. They are important to succeed. But we have covered a lot of ground. As always, Ash and Nick, thank you for the profound words.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, such a good time. Thank you both.
If you have a question you'd like us to answer in a future episode, we would love to do that. That's our competitive advantage. So head over to thestartuphelpdesk.com or on X/Twitter as thestartuphd and submit questions. The more questions you submit, the more episodes we can have, and we do love doing our episodes. But for now, the Startup Help Desk is closed. We will see you next time, but in the meantime, good luck in building your business.